the story that Jason was just mentioning is this Hopkins still wants private columns despite our deep opposition and falling campus crime. And I'm going to get into it in a minute. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about what the data is and just highlight some of the other work that the data team has done. So right now the data team is myself and a person named Ryan Little, who was at Mother Jones prior to this. Yeah, it's just really great to work with. So these are mine and Ryan's stories that we put out, some of them. Yeah, so the Banner is a new media publication that started in early June. I think June 6th was our launch day, which is very sort of exciting to get to be a part of a brand new media organization. I don't think it's something that every journalist gets a chance to be a part of throughout their own life. Being from the Baltimore area and living in Baltimore beforehand and moving away and getting to come back, it's like homecoming while there's a new paper starting has been a lot of fun. The Banner itself, covers Baltimore City, Baltimore County. We're expanding into Anne Arundel, Howard County, other areas, other counties in the area. I think we do, some of the best in-depth coverage of the city and area. So if you haven't read any of our stuff and you're interested in what's going on around here, I would obviously recommend the newspaper that I work at. Okay, so I'll just walk through some of these. I'm going to talk about the top three, so I won't get into them too much. Bottom three are all Ryan's stories. And I think they show a little bit of the sort of the unusual but usefully deep coverage that the Banner does on, with data. The top one, so there's been a variety of explanations for why Baltimore's shootings, why the Western District's shootings have increased. And a lot of people have, sort of attributed it to measurement error, or to being an anomaly, or a collection of different things. And I think Ryan does a really nice job of sort of addressing a lot of the critiques in that article, sort of providing inferential evidence that the decrease is actually a legitimate decrease attributable to this program called GVRS, which is the Group Violence Reduction Strategy. Run this going away. The bottom two, I won't spend too much time on that, but Brian does a nice GIS analysis of changing districts in Baltimore and what that means for crime rates in those different districts. And then the bottom one is some work he did with Brenna Smith, who does a lot of visual investigations for us into different white nationalists, I think specifically Stormfront and Adam Waffen posters that were appearing in the Baltimore area in the lead up to the November election. All right, on to my work. These are the three stories that I'm going to talk about. Two of them are co-bylined with reporters. One of them is just sort of a data analysis story. And I think each one of them highlights a different but important part of my work. I'm sort of presenting this initial framing of choosing a story, questions, learning, and contextualizing as being the general process that I go through with data journalism. I think, at least with my work, so my background is as a research statistician, I think there's a very significant overlap between the process of creating new and reliable facts in a research context and the kind of data journalism I do, and I think of this sort of process as being an essential part of that. So I'm going to start with the property tax story. We just put this out. I was very excited to work on it. For those of you who live in the city or live in the area, you're familiar with the property tax system in Baltimore and how onerous it can be. It has large social consequences as well. Yeah. So I think everyone always uses the same quote from Anna Karenina. The all good families are like, every bad family is bad in some way, or however it is. I don't think that's the best quote from Anna Karenina, though, so I wanted to use a different one for once. In the process of choosing this story, I think this is true, right? I think if it is true that there are as many minds as there are heads, there are as many kinds of love as there are hearts. I think every research project sort of starts in its own way. And so while I think it's important, and I do think it's important to be very intentional and thoughtful on the beginning of the project, because you save yourself a lot of headache in the end, I think the way in which you end up choosing the story or the inspiration for say that is my house was almost sold in tax sale. I'm a little embarrassed to admit that. I moved down to Georgia and didn't get the forwarding messages about the property tax, and so I, did not pay. My house was actually sold. What I'll get into is that tax certificates are what are sold through the tax sale process, not the home itself. So it's effectively, securitizing the debt and selling the debt for the house. That is what happened to me. However, right, like as many of you know, as UX researchers, by virtue of being the ones working on things, you're not a good example or barometer for the thing that you're working on. And so, my interest in this fundamentally was not what happened to me in my house, but rather, the sort of systemic issues that come along with the property tax system in Baltimore City. Baltimore City's property tax is nearly double the second highest, which I think is Charles County. That's right. And so I wanted to look into what if it's true, and it is true that Baltimore City has extremely high tax burdens, and at the same time has a lot of people who, can't afford those. In some manner of speaking, it's a regressive tax because it's flat across the board. I wanted to see what that turns into for, different people in the city. There's been some work done on this before, and of course, before any of these projects, I always do some pre-reporting, which I liken sort of to a literature review in academics, have a sense of what people have done before. The Abell Foundation has done some nice sort of survey research on people who have had their homes sold in tax sale to understand what those groups of people look like. MVLS is an advocacy group that has done some nice sort of legal research on the topic, and it's really mapped out what the whole process could look like of your home going through tax sale. The Baltimore Brew commissioned an article by a person named Allison Harris, who did a good job of explaining a lot of the potential fixes for Baltimore City's tax sale. What you may have noticed is that none of those are actually data-driven examinations of the process, so I wanted to do that. So again, I think this is the place that I always start with my projects. I think this is true of all data projects. That we want to start from a question, not just a fun little trick that you wanted to do with data. I understand that for many people that may not be true, but I think that ultimately that will produce more interesting results. The questions that we had were, how much money do investors make off the property tax system if I buy a tax lien from someone and resell the house after I foreclosed on it? How much money do I make in the aggregate? Investors, and I'll get into this, also make money off interest of the debt. How much money do they make from that? Who's affected, right? Who's losing their homes? Who's being charged interest? Who has to pay these exorbitant fees? The question of what is the geography of property tax? Where in the city do people lose their homes? What is the political geography of it? Yeah.
I got a question. Does Baltimore still have ground rents?
It does.
That's like this effed up thing that people. So it's one thing if you have a property tax, like standard property tax bill, and you're caught short, or a lot of people didn't even realize what the whole ground rents thing was, and they would be owing and not even realize it.
You can be an owner and still owe ground rent, right?
Yeah.
Like you can own the property and still have to pay rent on the land itself.
Yeah.
That's wild. Yeah, they do. It's harder to get the data on ground rents, but we've been interested in looking into that.
went to jail.
So with those questions, right, the next step is sort of like what data do I need to address these questions? For us, that usually means making records requests. Maryland has the Maryland Public Information Act, which gives us access to documents from government officials. What the law says, and become intimately familiar with this as a journalist, is that you're supposed to get your records within 30 days. They need to give you a response within 10. They should get it to you sooner, but 30 days is the hard limit. When we asked Baltimore City for property tax data, as you can see, we put our record request in June 21st, and we got our responsive documents on August 29th, which is breaking the law. That happens all the time. We are fortunate enough to have a PIA lawyer, a First Amendment lawyer, who takes people to task for that. We're currently in litigation with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner over autopsy records. But it's a situation where for many years, a lot of Baltimore media organizations either didn't have a PIA lawyer like Baltimore City's Department of Finance felt very comfortable not complying with the law. And I'm very proud to work somewhere that is willing to use the law as it's written as a cudgel to get us the records that we're owed. So we have the property tax data from Baltimore City, and we have state land records. This is from the State Department of Assessments and Taxation. When your house is assessed, when your house is sold, when your house was built, all of those things are maintained by SDAP. And so we were able to get those. They comply with the law, and census records as well. Do I have till 7:30? Is that right? Yeah. These are what my notes look like. This slide looked better in my head. Yes, so I think the next step is actually trying to learn something from the data. We know our question, we have our data, we want to build some sort of pipeline to make sense and answer our question. So just a brief overview of what the records looked like. SDAP was 24, there were 24 counties in Maryland. We had one fixed width file for each of them. Each one of these has 277 columns, somewhere in the range of 270 million records total for every property in the state. Everything you could want, right? Like it's how old your house is, what is the size of the house, how many bathrooms does it have, what are the 3 last sales, when were they sold, how much did it sell for, what is the owner's name, what are the name of the grantors, all of these things.
So are the 277 columns the same across all?
Fortunately, yes. That would have been a nightmare if that wasn't true. Yeah, thankfully, yes.
Now, these are available one at a time, if you like, online. Is there a bulk download that you can get?
There is, yeah. So we had to put in a request specifically for it. There's a company called SpecPrint that handles the downloads for SDAP, and they're great to work with. It's still, if you're interested in these records, reach out to SDAP first, and SDAP will put you in touch with SpecPrint.
Is there any charge for that?
Not for us. We asked for media fee waivers. I'm not sure what they would do with some of this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's somewhere between $100 and $200 per county. I was looking it up myself. If you have the data and it's shareable, I'd love a copy. Save myself all the bucks.
It's not shareable from us because they just make you sign
Yeah.
too fast. But they were great to work with.
Yep, it's good to hear.
Yeah. And then we have the City of Baltimore's tax sale data, which is interesting because, as I say, it's 21 columns and most are either uninformative or incomplete. I mean, their record-keeping systems are a disaster. The data is inconsistent. A lot of the entries are NA where they shouldn't be. I mean, it's a perfect example of messy data on the way in, and so you just have to spend a lot of time with it on the way in to make sure that you're not confused at the end. This became ultimately important where in the interest calculations that I'll get into in a second. But I just wanted to present this part of it too, because I don't think many people, when they think of journalism, think of sort of engineering diagrams and these sorts of data pipelines. But a lot of us do this kind of work. Yeah.
Looks like a mind map.
Yeah. I mean that's
Be a good piece of software to try this on.
Yeah, I've got my funny little symbols too. This is for a spatial join. Every time you see that little blob or overlap thing, the envelope is where I geocode things. It's just nice to be able to look at it in that way. So we have the data. We have some idea of how to put it together. We need to put it together first. And the problem here is that property addresses maintained in different places also often have different formats. You can have 122 South Saratoga Street or 122 S Saratoga Street, and there are sort of a million different variations on that problem. We can't match by block, ward, because it's very likely that in one apartment building, Suite 122 has been leaned, but Suite 121 has not. And it would just be a disaster if we screwed that up. So we use a package in R called Postmaster, which I don't know if everyone or anyone is familiar with, but I think about it as Lubridate for addresses. I discovered it maybe a couple months ago, and I use it in almost all of my projects now. It's fantastic. And so, we use Postmaster to standardize between the SDAT data and the City of Baltimore's property lien records, and ended up, I think it's like getting like 97% of the addresses to match in both directions, which was great. Yeah, it does a great job. Once we have joined SDAT data with the City of Baltimore's lien data, we also want to join with the parcel footprints to be able to do some more geographic analysis. That's much easier, right? Because whether or not the unit is 121 or 122, the footprint of the building is still the same. So we can't match on block ward, so it solves that problem for us, fortunately. And a lot of the back and forth was just making sure that the matching was complete, which, the way that I like to do that, especially when your data lends itself naturally to this sort of like geographic or visual representation, is just plotting this thing until it's complete. So, as you can imagine, the sort of iterative process was that half of the city would be missing on the match, and I would just keep going through that until the city was there. These are ages of buildings in Baltimore City, which I find very interesting. You can see, the Mount Vernon corridor is a little bit older. The Inner Harbor is very new. A lot of the Canton industrial area is very new as well. That's one of the things I love about Baltimore, is just its age in general. Investors make money in one of three ways in the property tax lien process. One is that they flip houses. Two is that they collect interest payments on liens. These are debts. So as soon as tax sale happens from the day your home is sold in tax sale, you start accruing either a 12 or an 18% interest rate, which for those of you who have loans know is an outrageous number. It's fee simple, right? So it's a simple interest, not a compound interest, but nonetheless, it's still a very high rate. And they also collect attorney's fees. Oftentimes, the investors are also the attorneys. This is almost always true, so they get to collect attorney's fees along the way. It's a very nice game they've constructed. What we found going through the process was that 2 of the 3 of these questions are tractable. The attorney's fees question is not really answerable. The problem is that depending on where you are in the foreclosure process, the amount of attorney's fees you're legislatively allowed to collect changes. For example, at the beginning of foreclosure, attorneys can collect $750 in fees. By the end of it, they can collect $2,500 in fees. The court records are not quite granular or really accurate enough to go through and say for each case how far into the process did it go, therefore we can assign this much maximum attorney's fees. We would still even then have to make the assumption everyone asks for the maximum amount, which is probably safe, but still an assumption. To calculate the amount of money investors made from flipping homes, right, we get the date of the tax sale and the date that the home is transferred after tax sale, and we know how much the house was transferred for. So we can look for the next sale after tax sale, take the difference between the amount paid, the amount bid at auction, and the next sale as the profit. The sort of immediate question is, well, how much are investors putting into each home that would reduce the profits? The answers are not really that much. Most homes are sold, there's a double closing, where an investor will pick up a home at tax sale, have the deed delivered to them, and then very shortly after the deed's delivered, resell the house. I think it's like 60% of these homes sell within 30 days. For those of you who know things about rehabbing houses, are too short to put any actual work into a home. More importantly, if we look at the assessment values after the resale, and find that the subsequent assessment after tax sale is almost identical to the previous assessment after tax sale, which implies that there's very little difference in the land improvements in between. Interest, and so this is kind of the interesting question, or the sort of important lesson from this project in many ways. I've already said that interest accrues immediately, different rates for homeowners and non-homeowners. But the question of interest is the amount of time after tax sale and before a homeowner pays back their loan, right, pays back their debt to an investor, interest accrues throughout that whole period. So the longer you wait to pay back the money, the more you owe in interest. Turns out that the Department of Finance's records on when homes are paid back is not wildly. There are a few entries that are impossible and inaccurate. So, they had some dates that redemption happened in 2057 or 2071. And so if you calculate the interest, made off that, it ends up being like $60 million, which of course is one of those nice little like sanity checks that you can program in, right? This is just way too much money. That couldn't be the case. And so we looked through and ended up finding that that's what was happening. It was just data errors on the Department of Finance's part. Yeah.
So, where is the profit in buying a house and selling it untouched 30 days later? Like, there's some arbitrage going on there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing is that, right, like a house that is assessed for $50,000 will often sell at tax sale for $4,000. The amount of liens that your house can be put into tax sale over, if you're a homeowner living in your home, is $750. And so that's sort of the baseline price at tax sale. So the arbitrage is really that, the tax sale system allows houses to be sold far below their, assessed values. Yeah.
So just people don't know about the tax sales, or it feels dirty to them? And
it's an investor gain mostly.
Yeah.
So I assume people know about it, but the problem is that you have, we have a story coming out about this, so I won't get into the specifics of the numbers, but you have a very small number of investors who have a lot of money. And so what they can do basically is bid on every property and, just sort of always outbid you. And people stop playing the game because, even if you bid them up, you won't get the house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll get to this, but can you talk a little bit about rates of homeowners versus renters versus just occupied houses that are
going through
yeah.
tax sale? Yeah, let me think for a second. Most of the homes that go into tax sale are non-owner occupied. And most of the money that's made is certainly non-owner occupied, in part because of the I do have this on the next slide. I don't know why I'm doing this. I can do it, I promise. It's also right here. Yeah. So, this is sort of what you were just asking, right? Like, partly it's due to the higher interest rate for non-owner occupied homes. Partly it's due to the amount of non-owner occupied homes that go into it. If I remember right, it's something like 70% of homes that go through tax sale are non-owner occupied. And it's certainly a higher percentage of homes that actually transfer hands, right? Because if you're a homeowner in one of those houses, like this is your life, you'll effectively do anything to hold on to it. And so that's the interest gain, right? Is these investors know that this is the most important asset in your life and that you will certainly try and pay back that debt by any means necessary. So what did we learn? We learned that there's enormous racial disparities in who is, suffering from the tax sale system. This is a map of buildings leaned per sort of community statistical area in Baltimore. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Lawrence Brown's work, but he has sort of coined the term the black butterfly. That is the black butterfly. We have sort of two neighborhoods. The highest two are Sandtown, Winchester, and Southwest Baltimore. I just can never believe this figure when I look at it. I know it's right, and I still can't believe it. 46% of all buildings in Southwest Baltimore have had property tax liens on them. That's, to be clear, not sold, but have property tax liens on them. 42% in Sandtown, Winchester have. We also, we have the more white residents in the tract, the less likely homes are to be lean. It's just, just like a simple correlation. We also fit logistic mixed effect scam to support this. This is true both of houses being leaned and houses being sold. The coefficient for the percent of black residents in a census tract shows us $37 million in income off tax sale in 6 years. Most of it comes from flips, which was kind of interesting because on the way in, we were told by activists that interest is sort of the main game that gets played. But yes.
It's interesting because I wouldn't have expected flips. I live in Union Square, which is right next to Southwest Baltimore. And we see so much vacancy in the nearby neighborhoods. I actually would have thought that these people were buying these houses and sitting on them.
Yeah.
So did your data show you anything about that?
Vacants are really interesting because it's a problem that the tax sale system is completely unqualified to address. Right, I'm going to say things that I don't necessarily agree with just to present the perspective of people who support the tax sale system. What they will tell you is that there is a financial incentive for investors to purchase homes and in doing so improve them, right? So it's sort of like the hand of the market will fix these homes that have been in a tax sale, transfer them to more responsible owners and they'll make the neighborhood better, quote unquote, right? What you see with vacants, what people will tell you with vacants is that the financial incentive is no longer there, right? Like it's hard to make money off a vacant because so much work necessarily has to go into it. As we said, investors don't want to put that work in. And so, there's no financial incentive with vacants, and so vacants appear on the tax sale list year after year. What we have, I think, is, there are 15,000 properties that have appeared on the tax sale list twice in the last 6 years, 4,000 that have appeared 3 times. Because your home can only appear on tax sale every 2 years, 3 is sort of the maximum. So we have 4,000 that are hitting the maximum, basically, in our data set.
Sorry, by vacants, you mean like properties that are effectively abandoned that like no one lives in, and the owner isn't trying to rent them out?
Yeah, exactly.
They're not livable. Many
Yeah.
of them have
okay.
been actually burned because of people squatting in them. You drive past, you can see the sky through the windows.
Yeah, they're totally.
Okay.
Yeah. Most. One of the really interesting questions here is that misclassification is a very big issue with very real consequences, right? Because there's that question of who is saying that, we've talked about homeowner occupied versus non-owner occupied. Who decides that? How is that maintained? That's done by SDAT. So SDAT records say whether a home is classified as homeowner occupied or not. But it turns out that they're very bad at knowing which homes have their owners in them. So we found 10,000 homes where the name of the person who is on the property tax lien is also the person who is said to be the owner, right? And so this would be a place in which the owner is living in the home. This would be an owner-occupied home. 6.6 thousand of those in SDAT are listed as non-homeowner occupied, so that's 2/3 of all of these homes are misclassified, which means that about 2/3 of the homes that go into tax sale are being, they suffer an additional burden that they shouldn't be suffering. Part of this is that it's very hard to get classified as a homeowner living in your house. You have to apply for something called the homestead tax credit, which is, okay, I see a lot of nodding faces. Yeah, I'm currently still applying for it. Just wrote an article about it on that. Yeah. And so then the last part of this for me is, sort of putting our findings in context. I think that's kind of the difference between, the work that I do now and the work I did, 6 years ago, is that finding real people and telling their stories as illustrations of what we're doing and to highlight the issues that they're living through is an essential part of our work as well. My colleague Sophie Casicos found and spoke with someone named Arnita Owens-Phillips, who almost lost her home through tax sale. The lien was purchased by Stonefield, who is going to play a major role in the next installment of our series. And her case, and I think why this is important and relevant to our work, really illustrates a lot of the problems that the data also shows, right? So this issue of misclassification, a lot of the time it happens when you have tangled title or an heir's property, which are, properties where, say, I die without a will, but my son has been living in this house for 20 years, taking care of me, and it's sort of understood in the family that he'll inherit the home. I die, he has 2 siblings, the house does not automatically go to him. And so even if he's been living there for 20 years, that home will be listed as non-owner occupied when I die. And that's exactly what happened to Juanita. The liens ballooned through interest and tax sale, and she was about to lose her home. Fortunately, I think it was NPLS or legal aid that helped her. There are these places that will collect donations and get grants to get people out of tax sale. So they help Juanita keep her house. This was a much less, hopeful and encouraging tax sale, the Edmondson Community Center. And this, sort of addresses your question as well. Right, this place sold for $5,000 on $2,500 in liens. Almost immediately afterwards, within like a week or two, the investor who had purchased the lien and foreclosed on the house, almost a week or two after they foreclosed, put up a private auction for the home and then sold it for $140K. Yeah, and it's, I feel very comfortable saying this, that's theft, right? I mean, there's no equity that people get back from that. You paid into this, you've purchased your home or your community center and paid the mortgage off, and then you get caught with $2,500 in liens, and then someone gets to make $135,000 without really giving you much. Yeah.
I was curious, in the case of the center, since it's kind of, I don't know, it could be used, was that being actively used, or was it just?
It was, yeah.
So when they flip it, does the new owner continue to run the community center?
So in this case, they're renting it back to the previous owners, and nothing's changing except for they lost their center and someone made $135K. Yeah.
Oh, they're renting it back to the people that owned it and lost it?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Yes.
So the previous slide is kind of like a view, using a racial lens of, where most lien sales are occurring, things like that. I would be curious to, that's a race-based one, like a follow-up slide of going strictly by like income, an economic distribution, and then if you compare the two, are more people of color who are in the same economic category affected in comparison to whites and stuff. Because, the slide about the race also includes, in a lot of cases, that people are lower income and stuff, and that kind of, we're talking about economics here. So.
Sure, yeah, so that's exactly why we fit that GAM. Is because, I wouldn't want to publish this kind of thing without thinking about exactly the analysis you're talking about. So the GAM we fit took into account all sorts of things that are germane to the question of whether or not you can pay your property tax bill. So income, poverty rate, the amount of the lien, the assessment value of the home, all of these things in the presence of the percent race in a census tract. And so even in the presence of all these things that are germane to the question of being able to pay your property taxes back, race is still strongly predictive of whether or not your house is either liened or sold. Yeah. Yes?
So suppose that the property, this tax sale system went away. By what mechanism would the city ensure that property taxes were paid?
Sure, yeah. So there are places that have tried this kind of thing, and specifically there's a pilot program called the HPP, called the Homeowner Protection Plan, which is basically you use the Department of Housing as a sort of buyer of last resort, where instead of involving investors in the process, you use this organization that will extend you a payment plan over time. So right now, it's within a year and a half you can lose your home. All of that money goes to the investor. There is no equity or any slow way to pay this back. If you got rid of the tax sale, what this HPP is trying to do, and what you have, I think in Poughkeepsie, New York, and Rhode Island has done a little bit of this also, is that you get rid of the investors and you use the state instead. And so the Department of Housing will extend your payment plan over 5 years, where you can pay your lien back slowly. I mean, you think about it, it's $2,500. That's doable over the course of a couple of years. So it's a low interest rate payment plan. There's still, you're right, the threat of losing your home in this process, right? Like if the Department of Housing this instead of private investors, they can still take your house after 5 years, right? And so the mechanism is still kind of the same. But the goal is not to take someone's home the way that it is for investors. It's to get the loan paid back with the, Department of Housing being the beneficiary of that, and then hopefully being able to, reinvest that money in housing instead of using it to, acquire more houses. In REM, judicial in REM, I'm just mentioning it really quickly because it's very interesting and it addresses the vacancy question. Are you familiar with in REM?
I've been following all the Banner's reporting.
Oh, no. Yeah.
Well, I also live next to 3 vacant houses
Yeah,
that
yeah.
could be, hopefully, somebody could live in them. They're not unlivable at this time,
Yeah.
but the person who owned them passed away 3 years ago, and they're sitting vacant. So I don't know, our community is trying to do something about it.
Yeah. And, in REM is one really good way for that to happen. So in REM is a new program that started last year, I think. It's only been used a couple times. It's still not working quite properly, but they're trying to expand it as well. It says that the city's DHCD, I think it is, the Department of Housing and Community Development, can take ownership of a vacant home where the liens exceed the assessed value of the house, and it shortens that window so that, if you do have this vacant where no investor, quote unquote, is going to want to buy it, the city can take control of it and rehab it themselves. And then the misclassification issue, I have spoken with the SDAT and the city's Department of Finance about this, and I think they are open to working on this. It's a pretty easy solution, right? Like I've found 6,000 of these houses where the homeowner's living in the house and they're misclassified. They could work much more closely with SDAT and figure out a way to correct those misclassifications. I think that's a really simple way for people to be subjected to the laws that they are supposed to be subjected to and not higher burdens. Hey, okay. Hopefully I'm faster this time. This is the story about Hopkins that I worked on that Jason was talking about. And this is slightly different, right? So this last story I worked on sort of, because I had thought it up and it had been this this story that started because of an event in my own life that I expanded into having some, interesting consequences for the city, or learning about interesting consequences. In this case, a reporter came to me with an idea. Johns Hopkins has been, since pre-pandemic, in the process of creating a police force. They had put the police force on hiatus for a few years and then had recently started working to have it take effect. We knew that they paused the plans, originally implemented because of a crime wave on Hopkins campuses. And we wanted to address the central question. If Hopkins wants to create a police force because there is increase in crime in Hopkins, vicinity, is that assumption a reasonable one? So they released shapefiles they released diagrams of the proposed jurisdictions, and the question was, how can we go from these shapefiles and this idea to a test of whether that assumption makes sense? Kind of tip of my hand, you can see the headlines, so you know what the answer. So I just said a few of these questions. What do crime trends in the proposed jurisdictions look like? Do they depend on the campus? Because the police force would cover Homewood, Eastern, and I believe they're on the third one right now. Does it depend on the year, and does it depend on the crime type? So violent crime versus non-violent crime is how we ended up categorizing it, but we started with the much more granular definition of various crimes as well. And like I said, how do these trends fit? So one of the things that Baltimore does somewhat well is release open data through Open Baltimore. I'm sure everyone's familiar with it. If not, it's a great resource. There's limited data, and a lot of the data sets they release are only partial, so they collect a lot of the columns that they release, and that are releasable, right? Like it's not PII stuff, they just don't include it, so you can put in records requests for more of that data. But so we use crime data from BPD to try and address this question. These are not quite shapefiles. They need to be created from reports. So I had a very fun afternoon clicking on these corners and creating a shapefile by hand of what the proposed jurisdictions look like. This ends up being very important because one of the, one of the restrictions on Hopkins's police force is that even in the proposed version, it would only be able to address crimes that happen strictly within Hopkins's campus. So, for example, if a crime happens across the street from Johns Hopkins, police from Hopkins would not be able to address it. And so it actually, makes our job a little bit easier because the only crimes we have to consider are ones that are placed within Hopkins's campus itself. Okay. So once we have our questions and we know the data that we need to address it, we can go about it. This was a pretty simple analysis. There's not much else aside from the crimes are already geolocated. We have a shapefile, and then it's just sort of a question of putting everything in the same coordinate system. The one BPD caveat for anyone who works with crime data, because I see this mistake a lot of the time, is that BPD data is victim level, not incident level. And so what you'll see sometimes is people will report crimes at the victim level, either in the media or elsewhere, when what they really care about is incident level crime. You can group it though by a collection of factors to make sure to turn victim level into incident level crime. Yeah, just to describe what we did, I'm sure everyone's familiar with SF, but SF is a great package that allows, I think, spatial features, allows you to do some nice GIS and more. So yes, we convert shapefiles to the right CIRS, join them with the BPD data, and this was the first chart I produced, a very nice spaghetti plot of violent crime and non-violent crime across the three campuses. Just very broadly speaking, you can see that crime at East Baltimore is a much, there you go, I'm going to Peabody. The crime on East Baltimore's campus is generally elevated relative to the other two campuses, but that you've had very large decreases, at least in nonviolent crime on East Baltimore's campus, which is sort of in line with broader crime trends, but that violent crime has either been it's pretty stable or having a slight decrease. This is true. People don't I think recognize this most of the time. It's really only homicide that's up. All property crimes are far down, and even most violent crimes are still down. Assault, aggravated assault in the city of Baltimore is elevated as well, and this is also somewhat true of rape crimes as well, although there are other explanations. People think it's an anomaly in the data as well, because you see a sharp decrease that doesn't seem believable.
Sorry, I was going to ask
Yeah.
you, what do you mean by victim level versus incident level? Is it like they're reporting on who was attacked versus like what happened, or?
So all of the, you get, let's say someone, you're walking back and someone holds us up on the way to our car, that would be considered one incident, right? But there would be two entries in the data set for it, one for me and one for you. And so, we would still want to call that one robbery, but
There's two victims?
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And so people will often report the victim level crime as the number of incidents because they haven't grouped it properly. Yeah. Just one more thing, we care more about crime rates than raw crime numbers. I do a lot of region level analysis, right? Baltimore County has 880,000 people, Baltimore City has 595, something like that. The same number of crimes with different denominators will imply very different things. So we use the ACS and the census tract level data and that with our crime information to get some reasonable denominators for it. The problem is that that shapefile that I drew, right, is of course not aligned with census tracts necessarily. I mean, it's not. And so we end up, doing some simple linear interpolation to, assign populations to the Johns Hopkins campus shapefile as well. There are questions because this was throughout COVID too, right? And the census did a lot of work and it's been rightfully criticized for not for biased estimates on campus populations, especially during COVID. I think the estimates are still reasonable for cities and campuses the size of Hopkins. I think from what I've seen, it's mostly small towns that have had this issue of large biases.
What was the bias thing? I was curious. What was the bias?
Sorry?
What was the bias? You said there was sometimes they were accusing?
Yeah, so small towns have been, their populations have been like biased downwards. So, you know, you will see a small town or a small campus estimated population being lower than is expected. And I think sometimes they get sued for this as well because of, you know, the allocation of resources that comes along with having a population of a certain size, which is totally reasonable. Yes, and so then this is our sort of like final check to yearly victim numbers, and jurisdictions agree with BPD data. After we've assigned, you know, crimes to certain campuses, we want to make sure that those numbers match what we see in the original data. So we spent a lot of time sort of taking a sample and examining them by hand. And here's the chart that ended up running with the final story. We ended up focusing on violent crime because, you know, that is really why you institute a police force. No one cares if you know, are stealing candy bars, but people don't want, you know, their kids being shot. And so what we see is that on East Baltimore, crime has actually decreased since the, you know, just before the moratorium and throughout the moratorium as well. Crime on Homewood and Peabody is either pretty stable or has a slight increase, but at such a small level that it raises the question of whether, you know, students' sense of lack of safety in the presence of a police force, or, you know, the difficulty that having a police force can have for students and people in the area is worth the small increase in crime that we see. Yes?
Where are Homewood and Peabody? Are they here in Baltimore?
Yeah, so Homewood is the main campus. It's the one, you know, like in Charles Village-ish area.
Yeah.
And then Peabody is the Peabody Library area in Mount Vernon.
Like north?
Yeah. North-ish, like north center part of the city. Yeah.
Maybe I missed this point. Like, what's the difference between having a private police versus like campus police? Like, are they similar? Or like, it seems like what they're proposing is something a bit more
I used to live in Charlottesville.
stronger?
about
Yeah, it's
10
an
years
armed
ago.
police force, so they would be armed.
Oh, campus, the campus police is more like civil arrest.
Like security guard kind of
Ah.
thing. Yeah. Yeah, and you know, that's the concern though, right? It's like people don't want armed police on campus. Yeah, this is what we show. Yeah.
So going back to that thing, I mean, just kind of eyeballing it, it looks like the blue line kind of dips down, the red, but the green kind of just kind of goes up.
Yeah.
Is there any reasoning behind that?
No, I mean, you know, it could be a variety of things.
I wasn't sure if the like population got larger there or if the campus, I don't know much about the campus setup, if it grew or an area was.
I mean, slightly. The other thing I think about that, I mean, we also did see more crimes, like, but at a minimal level on the Homewood campus. The way I think about it too is like it's still within the confidence bands, so I don't necessarily treat that as a large enough difference to, you know, factor into policy, for example. Yeah, that's my thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah, could you actually talk a little bit about that? I mean, just thinking about things like confidence bands, the whole rise seems like, I don't know, I mean, what do I make of that?
Well, you know, obviously, like, the confidence bands between like 2018 and 2014 are pretty close to non-overlapping, right?
Yeah.
We can consider that like a statistical test of difference between them. So I do buy that like East Baltimore's crime changed between 2014 and 2018. For the most part, you know, like crime on these campuses has been pretty stable, even at like a numbers level too, which I think is a very real response to Hopkins' police force. And this is something that like Jessica Calafetti, the reporter who worked on this, a lot of her work kind of shows, is that there's not really a huge clamoring of support for there wasn't at the beginning clamoring of support for the Hopkins police force. It seemed like something that, she has sort of emails to this effect that a small group of donors wanted, and it got implemented as a part of that. Yeah, yes. Just behind you. Okay.
Actually, I'm curious, as a data journalist, how you think about things like confidence bands. That is actually something where I think most people who know exactly what we're looking at, but you're trying to reach a much broader audience who doesn't really know about confidence intervals and things like that. So how do you think about showing that in your work?
Yeah, it's a great question. The sort of like the non-helpful answer probably is that we include a short description at the bottom of what it is that you're looking at. The real answer though is that I would rather present uncertainty in a way that might be initially confusing than act as though there aren't uncertainty bounds on the statistics that we're putting in our stories. I also, and I get into this because I've been so slow, I don't know that I'll actually get to it. I think that the New York Times over the last 10 years has done a great job of expanding people's visual vocabulary. And I think that lay people have learned a lot about different types of charts because the Times has published them. And I think that what the next 10 years or so of data journalism, hopefully, I think this will happen, but I think what is going to teach people is statistical literacy. I mean, you already have people becoming more familiar with models because of COVID and the concept of exponential growth, and everyone was talking about IHME. You even had people critiquing models in public. And so I think the next 10 years you're going to see a lot more of that. And so I present these with the hope that people will be confused enough to read the explanations.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah.
What year was the George Floyd situation?
That was 2020, and then Freddie Gray was 2015. And so a lot of people attribute the rise in crime post that to Freddie Gray and everything.
And so one of the, I don't know how much there is to a feeling or sense that some people have is since one of these incidents that police have sort of backed off of enforcement.
Sure.
And that possibly some of the drop in incidents are the fact that police are not showing up or something. I don't know if there's any kind of empirical evidence of that, but maybe your next slide says something like somebody said they feel like it's still very dangerous, but the stats are showing that it's not.
Yeah. So I've heard people say that before. I think especially with violent crime, that's kind of a hard argument to make.
Yeah, because then you have definite proof.
Exactly. If you're a victim of violent crime, right, you would want to report that sort of thing. I think it's mostly, patrol stuff that has gone. I think there's limited
things like that.
Yeah, I still think there's limited evidence of that, but I think especially in this case, it's hard to make that argument. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just curious about the scale on the y-axis. Is that single digits?
It
so for
is
example,
crimes.
maybe 0 for Peabody or close to 0?
Yeah, it's crimes per 10,000, I think. Yeah, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And so this is the quote that Jessica got from the person sort of advocating on the inside for this, and the person who will be the head of it. We're still besieged by violence, and it's unacceptable, which I find very interesting given the statistics that we were able to show in this project. I also think it's relevant that no other private universities in Maryland have private police forces. There's been a significant amount of student and faculty opposition. A survey conducted, I think in 2019, estimated that 75% of students on campus didn't want a police force. That number's a little lower in the post-survey. I think it's something like 60%, 65%, but it's still a majority. And again, the fact that police can only police strictly within the bounds of the jurisdiction makes them just generally less helpful, even if it were to be implemented. Yeah.
Well, I guess especially considering some of these quotes, could you talk, and maybe for the last story too, could you talk a little bit about your thoughts on, I guess not just starting a story and then choosing to write a story, but deciding whether to continue pursuing and hammering home some of these ideas that have been presented and are, of course, still going to be relevant for policymakers in months to come.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think with this, in particular, it's a combination of two things. One, this is this person who is deeply involved in the planning and execution of the Hopkins police force's genuine opinion. This is the way in which he is presenting what he believes to be the strongest argument in favor of the Hopkins police force. And so, we've gotten to this point in the story where, we know that this sort of thing isn't true. But it's important to present that argument, if only to show the way in which it isn't in alignment with the actual, what the data supports. I think that was our goal from the beginning, right, was to see whether or not the data comports with the, assumption behind the creation of the force. And so we have to, I think, present what that assumption is in the words of the people making it. And I think that's broadly true, right? Like when we write stories, we want to, first start from, an even examine. It's like a Bayesian thing almost, right? Like you throw a slab on it, all possibilities are equally likely. You go through the process and start believing one thing more than another. And then, when you get to a point that you think you have something interesting, you want to present what the people who don't believe or believe something different than what the evidence shows believe and why they believe it. I think that's why we do this here. Yeah. Yes?
All right, keep it. So on the second line, I guess my eyes kind of gloss over stuff sometimes. So I was thinking, I read, no other universities in Maryland have private police force, leaving off the private part. So I'm thinking, well, yeah, Frostburg, not the same situation as at the, but in Baltimore, how many other private universities are there in Baltimore? There's like Loyola, Notre Dame, I think. There's quite a
There's several.
there's several, and so it is fair to compare their situations with Hopkins. So, that takes you away from comparing downtown Baltimore to downtown College Park, or obviously very different situations. But there are a lot of private, I don't know if it's a lot, but there are a number of private universities in Baltimore itself.
Yeah, totally.
You go comments over especially if I ask the question. Did you do the same analysis for any of the other universities just to see how they compare?
We didn't. I mean, we looked at the, there's blanking on who does it, but there's a survey of universities that they aggregates the crime on campus, and they do a similar rate. They're self-reported numbers, and it doesn't include all the crimes that happen on campus, so it's not exactly the same thing. But Hopkins, for example, does not show a wildly elevated rate. Yeah. Yes?
I was wondering, I could tell you use at least some R, but do you primarily use R?
Almost exclusively.
Yeah.
If I need to use like TensorFlow or something like that, I'll work in Python. But I really despise Python. I know, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was so close. Okay, how many minutes?
Michael. I don't see Michael. I don't know, like 10 minutes.
Okay, cool. I will try and be quick. So this was, these are some of my favorite stories. So once in a while we get to do like a poll analysis story or like a pure data analysis story. This was in the wake. This was after the election. And so it was comparing, electoral results from 2018 and 2022, just to get a sense of what the political geography in both of those elections were and how they changed, along with some other questions. This is what I was just saying, NYT advanced visual journalism, but I think we're just going to have more, and you're seeing it, right? At the Washington Post, they have Climate Lab that just came out. They have the Department of Data as well that's been doing some nice stuff. I think this is just going to be more and more common as people gain statistical literacy in general. So I've been excited to get to do this at the Banner, right? They just sort of give me free rein. They say, I'll come to them with a data set, and they will just basically let me analyze it and then publish a story based on some interesting things that I find, which for me is a blast. And we of course had questions coming in that we wanted answered. How do these voting trends in Maryland and Baltimore City change? Do black and white voters differ in their preference for Wes Moore? As I hope everybody knows, the first black governor of Maryland. Did black and white voters differ in their preference for cannabis legalization? And so one, the sort of data part of this is that, there's no way to really answer these questions in any interesting way using county level data. So we needed to use precinct level data. For whatever reason, we are still the only people who have analyzed precinct level data for the Maryland election. Part of that, I think, is that the State Board of Elections doesn't do a particularly good job of making their data available. So yeah, we got the precinct level voting results from the State Board of Elections. Precinct level results from 2018 from the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering Group, and precinct shapefiles from the Maryland Department of Planning. This is pretty, at least from my perspective as a person who cares a lot about public records and likes fighting for them. The records for Montgomery County and Kent County still hadn't been released at the time of the election, and at the time of the primary, none of the updated shapefiles for the post redistricting precincts have been released. We ended up using like a Voronoi tessellation method to estimate precincts, which was kind of a fun little project. But crazy, right? How do you now release that's your job, that's your main thing, is you have to release the updated districts, otherwise people don't know what their precincts are. Yeah, so the precinct level results came in XML, so we parsed that with XML2. This is sort of an idiosyncratic problem, but precinct names and voting data and shapefiles are often different, so matching the two can be a little difficult. It wasn't that hard to see the pattern and how the names were different, but you had to examine it by hand and figure the pattern out and then apply it. It was much, much worse in Georgia where I was before, because there was no real regular difference between how precincts were named in voting data and in the precinct shapefiles. There was something like 2,700 precincts in Georgia, so we had to go through them by hand and change all the names, which was awful, just truly horrible. And like I say, once we have the precinct and the voting data matched, the fun but dangerous part is the actual data analysis. These are what our maps look like in 2018 and 2022. They're just sort of immediately, what's interesting about them, I think, is immediately apparent. Right, we do a sort of typical choropleth map where the intensity of a particular color aligns with the vote share that party's candidate got. And you can see the way in which, and these are sort of equivalent statements, Wes Moore outperformed Ben Jealous, and Dan Cox underperformed relative to Hogan. Especially sort of in this western horn of Baltimore City and Baltimore County, which is sort of the black stronghold in the city and the county. There's a lot. The percentage of black residents in census tracts in this area is higher than it is elsewhere. But what's really interesting is you see that expansion even north towards the Towson area, and even eastwards towards what is generally a Republican stronghold in East Baltimore City and Baltimore County. At the state level, I find this really, really interesting. There's basically an unbroken block of support for Wes Moore from south of DC, right? DC's right there. South of DC all the way north through Towson. But that this whole stretch it voted at least 51% in favor of Wes Moore. And this is only available through precinct level data, right? If we don't use precincts here, we can only get one color per county, which is much less interesting, I think, than the geographic granularity we get from the precincts. Just for our last questions, is Moore preference related to race? Pretty clearly it is, but I think it is in a very interesting way. This is the percentage of black residents in precinct. All white precincts, they have a generally lower preference for more, with kind of like a soft cap at 60% preference for him. But once you get to like, 15% white in a tract, it's more or less entirely mixed. You could sort of pick a census tract and not entirely be sure what the preference for more would be. And then, as you get into census tracts with higher percentages of black residents, you have almost exclusive support for Westmore. And I think that's just a really interesting dynamic at different levels.
Hey, what's that one dot?
This one? Yeah, I actually don't remember. I should, but yes, that's a very good question. Yeah, I should be able to answer that.
But you know it wasn't an error?
Yes. Yeah.
There are precincts, especially in Baltimore County, that have like 6 people in them.
Oh.
And I'm willing to guess that outlier is one of those. They're a pain to filter out.
I will look into this afterwards, and I will email the answer. Yeah, I'm very interested also. I don't remember. Yeah. And then the second question is, what do opinions on the proposition related to legalization of marijuana look like? This was also at the precinct level. We have information on this. So each one of these dots, the height, again, right, I have just jittered the points on the violin plot to make them slightly more visible. The height means nothing.
Violin plot?
Sorry?
Violin?
Violin plot?
Yes, yeah. There's a violin plot underneath it. You can't quite see it. Oh, no, it's not. Yeah. Yes, underneath all the points, there's a violin plot. And so you see something similar where support among black census tracts is slightly higher, with the sort of specific reason being that census tracts where the majority of the population is not black sort of has a longer tail. You end up with some tracts that are very not in favor of that. And then again, violin plot, exclamation point. It's nice to be able to include visualization types that don't typically get used. I got some pushback for this when I published it, or when we were leading up to publishing it, that no one would understand it, and then we got some nice feedback that actually did make sense, which was
Violin was up and down.
So this is just the last plot, just to sort of summarize how I think about data journalism as a process. I think this is usable just outside of data journalism as well, and can be used kind of as a broader research, a way of codifying a research process. But I think it's specific to my work, at least on the outsides of it. And I have it in this funnel shape because I think we honestly, at least in the journalism world, spend as much and more time on the outsides as we do in the middle, just by virtue of how we want to present our work. But that what connects the two sides together is the actual statistics of the process. One of the places that I think data journalism is going to go in the next few years is more serious emphasis on research methods themselves. I think that so far we've done a lot of counting, we've done a lot of summary work, but we've done much less actual statistical studies on the way in. Frankly, I haven't done a great job of presenting research method-driven work today, but a lot of what I've done in the past has been more focused on that, and I think it's especially interesting and relevant, and you'll see more and more of it from journalists in the future. So, with that said, thank you everybody for coming. I'm sorry for going over.
Was there any final questions that you wanted to ask?
I think we're going to keep you late here tonight. I have sort of a vaguely ethical question. So like in the Johns Hopkins work, it's interesting because narratively there's a contrast between what Johns Hopkins is saying and what was saying. Supposing the data had confirmed what they were saying, is there still a story there, and would you still have published it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we would have had to, right? We went in with the question of does this assumption make sense? if the answer is like crime is rampant on Johns Hopkins and, you know, it's Mad Max inside the walls of Peabody, and, you know, I think we do have to run it. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I think there are places.
Does your editor agree with that?
Yes, definitely. And I think there are places where like the question is probably trickier. I'm not sure I can think of one right now. But I think especially with this one, right, because the public policy question is so important, and, you know, it is already in the process of happening, the answer is a little easier, just because, you know, we really do want to know the answer to this and would really like to publicize, you know, whether or not this police force makes sense. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, all right, well, thank you.